Part 5 of the Shergold Weir Report, Recommendations. Hello everyone and welcome to Part 5. Let's have a look at the recommendations from the report. So recommendation number 1, the registration of building practitioners. The problem identified. Registration of practitioners is a regulatory mechanism for providing public accountability. Whilst all jurisdictions register building practitioners as part of their compliance and enforcement systems, the categories that are registered differ. Now, just as a commentary on this, you have to understand that this is done not to create a guild. Building practitioners, it's not about, a guild or isolating or limiting members having access to performing these tasks or these profession or these practices. It's for consumer protection. It's all about protecting the consumer from dodgy operators. Now, this affects the mobility of participants and creates complexity in implying mutual recognition. I can attest to that as an architect. More importantly, there are gaps in accountability of practitioners with key responsibility for compliance with the NCC across Australia. Whilst there is some crossover, the skills for the design and construction of commercial buildings differs significantly from the skills required for the design and construction of domestic buildings. Many practitioners specialize in or have capabilities limited to either the commercial or domestic sectors. Unfortunately, in many jurisdictions, the scope of work that can be performed by some categories of registered practitioners is not limited to the type of design or construction work they have the capability to perform. This results in registered practitioners taking on building work for which they are not fully competent. Well, although fire safety systems are a crucial component of commercial buildings and occupy a significant part of the NCC, most jurisdictions do not register the practitioners who have expertise in fire safety system design, installation, or maintenance. Similarly, the design of a multi-story building relies on the expertise of structural engineers, but 3 jurisdictions do not register that occupation. Now let's just pause for a moment and let that sink in. 3 jurisdictions in Australia don't register engineers. Just think about that. Does that scare you? Because it scares me. Builders are responsible for building work and the supervision of contractors, but not all jurisdictions register buildings for all type of commercial building work. I mean, this is the 21st century or current year. You think we'd have this already tightened up. I guess it's just Australia. She'll be right, mate. Most commercial buildings include complex fire systems that require maintenance and testing to ensure that they will operate as intended in the event of a fire. Many key stakeholders believe that the standard of maintenance of fire safety systems post-occupancy is poor. Yes, I can attest to that personally on jobs that we've worked on where we're doing renovation work in a multi-story apartment building, and existing fire safety equipment didn't work. They didn't discover it until they actually went in there and tried to modify it. There were issues. So you've got to, if you live in one of these buildings, you're on the body corporate, make sure that it's maintained. Make sure the people maintaining it give you evidence that they're actually testing it, actually maintaining it, that it works, because it will save lives. However, back to the report. However, most jurisdictions do not require fire safety system maintenance contractors to be registered. Wow. That is another concern. So recommendation 1, here's the meat of it. That each jurisdiction requires a registration of the following category of building practitioners involved in the design, construction, and maintenance of buildings: builder, site or project manager, building surveyor, building inspector, architect, engineer, designer, draftsperson, plumber, fire safety practitioner. I could not argue with any of that. That makes a lot of sense. So implementing the recommendation. Each jurisdiction will need to have complementary provisions which provide that only registered practitioners can perform the work for which they hold registration. This should extend to ensuring that only appropriately qualified and registered practitioners can prepare performance solutions. Exemptions for owner-builder builders performing building work on domestic buildings may be appropriate. I think we need to make sure that the freedom that building surveyors or building certifiers seem to think they have in determining who is capable of doing this work needs to be removed. It needs to be tightened up. It needs to be explicitly stated in legislation who can do this work, to stop building surveyors or certifiers just saying, yep, you're competent, you're competent, you're competent. And I've seen this happen here in Queensland. You know, in architecture, completely unlicensed, unregistered architects doing the work. What's the point of having all these mechanisms in place? It is important that each category of regulation have defined subcategories which limit the scope of work that can be performed by reference to classifications of buildings and or building heights and floor areas. That was always in place. Well, that's in place here in Queensland with builders as well. I remember in Victoria, my father was a builder and he is licensed, limited how many stories he could work up to 3 stories. At a minimum, subcategories referable to commercial and domestic buildings should be applied to each category. For the categories of engineers, plumbers, and fire safety practitioners, there should be categories for various disciplines. The following are proposed. Okay. Engineers. They're proposing civil, structural, hydraulic, mechanical, geotech. Plumbers, water, drainage, sanitary, and gas. Yep. Fire safety system installers, fire safety engineers, fire protection system engineers, fire safety system installers, fire safety system maintenance contractors. This is, yeah, all of these recommendations, pardon me, all of these recommendations seem very reasonable. Further consultation should be undertaken with industry with a view to reach agreement on the full range of appropriate disciplines to be included. Each jurisdiction has specific legislation for the registration of architects. While this need not change, the accountability and regulatory oversight of architects should be consistent with other categories of building practitioners and align with the recommendations in this report. This will mean that changes are required to legislation regulating architects to provide the following. Okay, this is one for me. I need to have a coffee before I read this. The introduction of subcategories which limit the scope of work that can be performed by architects by reference to classification or types of buildings. Oh, bugger, I don't like that one. I can appreciate it. Definitely, I can appreciate it. But, yeah. National consistent requirements for registration of architects. Yeah. Mandatory CPD for architects. We've just gotten that in Queensland. Appropriate power for the architect licensing body to audit the performance of architects. Recommendation 6 and 7. And a statutory duty on architects to prepare documentation which demonstrates that proposed building work will comply with the NCC. Okay. Now, as an architect, I would have no problem with all of that if they allow us to have a fee scale. If they allow us to have a fee scale prepared by the Institute of Architects, which we used to have, that I can give to a client saying, this is the recommended fee by my profession that allows me, that says what I'm required to be paid to meet these requirements. That's what I would want to comply with this, because they're wanting to put more responsibility on architects. Because the problem is you have project managers who will cut your scope, reduce your drawings. So it's I completely agree with that, and I've done it. In our projects, we have burned our fees preparing a quality level of documentation on jobs where we wanted to do it we were hoping that providing a certain level of quality of drawings would lead to more work. And we find often it didn't matter. It's just the fees. You just get judged on the fees. And yeah, you can burn all your money producing this stuff and someone will come in cheaper and win the work and do a shite job of it. Okay, so that's interesting that they're going after architects. But yeah. Bloody hell, I don't like this first one. Anyway, because if you look at my portfolio, what have we worked on? Mining jobs in one instance, $20 million. To, Lorna Jane fit outs there, to some health things there, everything. So, sorry, I need a coffee. Further observations. In identifying the categories referred to in the recommendation, we have had close regard to the terms of reference and the fact that the recommendations are to be directed to strengthen the effective implementation of the NCC. Jurisdictions can and do register other practitioners operating within the building and construction industry, such as demolishers and electricians. Registration of such trades can be worthwhile. The recommendation is not intended to exclude other categories of work that jurisdictions may choose to register. That makes sense? The building and construction industry is evolving fast. As the technology of building construction changes and innovative practices are introduced, new forms of expertise emerge. There may be justification in the future for other categories of practitioners to be included in a nationally consistent approach if evidence emerges that work performed is sufficiently complex and relates to areas of high-risk building design, construction, or maintenance. In some jurisdictions, various trade contractors are required to hold registration when contracting directly with owners. These trade contractors do not require registration if they are subcontracting to a builder. We have not made recommendations for a nationally consistent approach to registration of trade contractors, as this is likely to impose a significant regulatory burden on the building and construction industry and on regulators nationally, particularly in smaller jurisdictions. We've been unable to conclude with certainty that such a burden would be warranted. Jurisdictions that do choose to require trade contractor registration as part of their warranty or consumer protection regimes should work together to harmonize the categories of trade contractors they register. When the builder contracts directly with an owner, it is the role of the builder to undertake building work using employees and subcontractors. It is recommended that the builder remains the primary person accountable for the proper construction of building work. Where necessary, this role should be set out in legislation. An exception to this position is from fire safety systems installers. The fire safety systems in buildings can be based on complex fire engineering designs and performance solutions. The installation and proper functioning of these systems is a critical building safety feature that warrants registration of specialist contractors. Yeah, that seems like a very reasonable and sensible approach. Even the recommendations for architects seems like a reasonable and sensible approach, even though they frustrate me a little bit. But yeah. So recommendation 1. What do you think in the comments, guys? Do you think that's a good one? Give me some feedback. Recommendation 2. Before I start, more of my Steiner coffee. It's good stuff. Consistent requirements for registration. Okay, the problem identified. Currently, where the same category of practitioner is registered in 2 or more jurisdictions, there are often different requirements for registration. Nationally consistent training packages are limited. Each jurisdiction recognizes different levels of qualification and experience when assessing applications for registration. This makes the operation of mutual recognition burdensome. Some states and territories have been reluctant to register practitioners registered in other jurisdictions on the basis that they believe the registration standards set out by other jurisdictions are of a lower level. Great. Unnecessary impediments to the movement of skilled practitioners imposes an economic cost to the industry, limiting competition and reduces choices. Yes, it certainly does. A nationally consistent approach to the requirements for registration of building practitioners, recommendation 1, would facilitate the development of appropriate training packages for those practitioners. This should lead to nationally recognized qualifications for each category and subcategory of registered practitioners, greater labor mobility, and a more comprehensive national market for appropriate insurance products. That's interesting. I should organize a talk with my insurance broker to get his perspective on that. The public needs to be assured that practitioners are trained and experienced in applying the NCC. They also need confidence that they are people of integrity and that where possible are covered by insurance. So recommendation 2. that each jurisdiction prescribes consistent requirements for the registration of building practitioners, including certified training, which includes compulsory training on the operation and use of the NCC as it applies to each category of registration, additional competency and experience requirements, where it is available, compulsory insurance in the form of professional indemnity and a warranty insurance together with financial viability requirements where appropriate, and evidence of practitioner integrity based on an assessment of fit and proper person requirements. That all seems fair. As architects, we've got to deal with most of that anyway. As building designers in Queensland, you've got to deal with most of that anyway. So implementing the recommendation. A national consistent approach to regulating building practitioners is vital. However, these expanded requirements could be implemented progressively based on categories of practitioners. Given the significance of their role, priority should be given to building surveyors. Yes, an essential element of training packages must be training on the NCC and the manner in which it needs to be applied. This is not presently a compulsory unit of study for all qualifications, which are required for registration. It should be effective implementation of the NCC. Well, as an architect at university, we got nothing on the building codes at all. I remember when Rachel and I were tutoring in final year in their professional practice subject, we started giving lectures on the NCC. We organized that they had to take one of their designs they did as a student in a previous year, create a set of working drawings, and then look at the National Construction Code, the building code at the time, and apply that to it. And look, make sure it was disabled compliant, do a NCC review and assessment of it. And we were, the students said, wow, for once, they actually learned something useful, practical, and it was a nightmare because their designs were shit. They were just conceptual, wanky stuff. And then they had to do technical drawings of it. And, the ones that were like the Superstar 7s that were the wankers, frankly, they really had a hard time at it. And, some of them really appreciated with it. And I remember I was sitting on a panel, or no, a practice committee at the Institute of Architects, and there were people complaining, other architects complaining that we were teaching them this stuff or getting them to implement practical building codes at university when it should just all be about design and those type of things. And that got me really, really frustrated and angry. Really did. Because this legislation is in place for a reason. And a lot of it is to do with public safety and amenity. And, you're having students designing buildings where they can't even calculate how many toilets they need to have. Or ensuring that they had adequate clearances to meet fire escape, at least the deemed to satisfy requirements, or even how to look it up. So if you're interested, go to my Practical Architect channel, and you can see, I think we've got a lecture up there on toilet calculations. I'll have to see, maybe not anymore, but that's what we looked at. So as an architect, yes, that should be required more on the courses. So fit and proper, going back to the report, fit and proper person requirements are the foundation of public trust in the integrity of practitioners. These include such matters as bankruptcy and criminal checks. We have that in my profession. In the first instance, financial viability requirements are most relevant for builders. They may be justification for other categories of practitioners to be subject to similar requirements. Yep. So, further observations. Presently, some jurisdictions rely on accreditation by industry bodies as the basis for registration. There is merit in this approach. Well-run industry accreditation can ensure that the competencies of practitioners are tailored to their area of work and can alleviate state or territory regulators from the detailed assessment of applications. I'm sure a lot of them wouldn't even have the capability to do that. If this approach is taken, the state or territory licensing body should have clear statutory responsibility for auditing performance and disciplining registered practitioners. Of course, industry associations should still take responsibility for holding their members to account and cancelling accreditation. A collaborative approach to disciplinary oversight will be beneficial. All of this is what I'm used to in architecture here in Queensland. It is important that as many practitioners as possible hold professional indemnity and a warranty insurance in order to support accountability. It is acknowledged that insurance is not currently available for the range of practitioners proposed to be registered. This weakness needs to be addressed. There should be ongoing discussion between governments and the insurance industry to ensure the best possible insurance is available to all categories of registered practitioners. Yeah, that's the thing. Sometimes you can't get the insurance. And there's certain things that, as an architect, I can't get any insurance to cover me for anything to do with asbestos. I can't even say the word asbestos on anything. I can't even provide a copy of the asbestos report for a project to a client, because then it'll void my insurance. I'll have liability issues. I can't even pass that on because of the risks associated with it. So, recommendation 3, continuing professional development. The problem identified. Building practitioners operate in a dynamic environment. New products, technologies, and practices are actively encouraged through the performance-based NCC, which itself is amended every 3 years. The introduction of nationally consistent mandatory registration requirements provides a mechanism to ensure currency of competencies. Those already practicing need to have an up-to-date knowledge of the current edition of the NCC. I'm happy that they're not updating it every year anymore. Many stakeholders report that building practitioners across the industry do not have a sufficient understanding of the NCC or its revisions. This has led to non-compliance or poor quality documentation of compliance. Misinterpretation or ignorance of the requirements of the NCC is not uncommon. Indeed, this failure has been offered as one explanation for the prevalence of non-compliant cladding on buildings across Australia. Yep. And often, as the designer, you'd be going to the certifier during the design stage to give you advice on that. So recommendation 3, that each jurisdiction requires all practitioners to undertake compulsory continuing professional development on the National Construction Code. Yay! CPD on the NCC. Oh boy. That excites me. Yay. Can you tell, guys? Can you tell? So, implementing the recommendation. Regulators need to have mechanisms to identify common non-compliances, which may indicate systematic misunderstanding of the requirements of the NCC. Insurers may also have data that they will be willing to share. This intelligence should be collected, shared nationally, and fed back to the industry. It should also inform compulsory topics for CPD relevant to each category of registration. Some of those consulted have been critical of CPD. Reservations have been expressed that CPD schemes can leave the content of training up to the discretion of participants, which reduces the relevance and effectiveness of learning. Compulsory CPD schemes should provide for targeted learning on topics of genuine relevance to improve the competency of practitioners. Such topics should be focused on improving the understanding of the NCC and ensuring its effective implementation. So, further observations. Industry associations can play a key role in the delivery of CPD, provided that there is collaboration with regulators to ensure that the content of training is appropriate. The only issue with that is it's costing money. They may be willing to assist in the administrative oversight of CPD schemes through their accreditation schemes. Yeah, because revenue. Government may wish to consider incentives to support compulsory training on the NCC. Yeah. Yep. Yes, they should. At least it's free now. At least the NCC is free. As an architect, I've got to do CPD. What about some of you other guys, some of you tradies? How would you feel about CPD? Do you have to do it? I don't know. I'm sure you would, just out of interest, but let me know in the comments, guys. So recommendation 4, career paths for building surveyors. My wife, actually, Rachel, was considering becoming a building surveyor a few years ago. Now, she's really a mother of 4, so all of that's out the window. But it was interesting to see how little credit she'd get for her architectural qualification. It'd be another 4 years of study. The problem identified. The role of building surveyors is critical to the building approvals process. Unfortunately, they may not be an adequate supply to meet future needs. The average age of building surveys is now over 50. Wow. And they are ill-defined and inadequate career pathways to becoming a registered building surveyor. Are there any young building surveyors watching this video? Thumbs up, leave a note in the comments, say hello, because you're going to have no problem finding work. For many other categories of building practitioners, careers are established through apprenticeships, certified training, or other education pathways. Given the criticality of building surveyors to ensuring NCC compliance, more needs to be done to encourage new entrants to this profession, especially for those who have experience in the building and construction industry. Recommendation 4, that each jurisdiction establishes a supervised training scheme which provides a defined pathway for becoming a registered building surveyor. Implementing the recommendation. A nationally consistent supervised training scheme for building surveyors designed in collaboration with industry would be most effective. Such a scheme should provide for comprehensive training on regulatory obligations, ethical conduct, and operation of the NCC. Further observations. Clarity is needed to the extent to which trainees must be supervised and how trainees can attain experience to achieve the necessary requirements for registration over a set period. The legal requirements for physical supervision of trainees, not just online, not in an iPhone, needs to be pragmatic so that it is commercially viable for businesses to invest in trainees. That's the issue here, because if fees aren't high enough, you'll be competing with businesses that can't be bothered to train people. I know in architecture, all of a sudden a few years ago, everyone aged 21 got paid the minimum adult wage, so you couldn't hire them as cheap-ass students and pay them $6 an hour and train them up anymore, even when they were at university. And that caused a real issue. It meant that these people weren't competitive. They weren't useful for you. So we learned that the hard way in our business, training up these people, and then you lose them in a year or two. It was great when you can get someone really cheap because, okay, they get a bit of money. They can't really live off that. They can kind of struggle, but it's better than them working illegally for free. You can actually afford to invest time in them, and everyone wins. But otherwise, you can't, and people will offshore work. Governments may wish to consider incentives to support the development of and participation in a supervised training scheme. Okay. Recommendation number 5. Improving collaboration between regulators. The problem identified. In each state, multiple state government bodies and local councils have a role in building regulation. Private building surveyors may also have enforcement powers in relation to building works for which they have been appointed. This results in a fragmented system of regulatory oversight which is prone to duplication, confusion, unclear lines of responsibility, and a lack of information sharing. This can be exacerbated in cases of some authorities believing that they have received inadequate funding. To the public, especially when things go wrong, this often looks like a game of buck passing. Oh, yes, it does. With the introduction of private certification, some local governments have taken the position that they should no longer have responsibility to respond to complaints about building work because a private certifier has been appointed. Okay. Yeah. Okay, good luck, guys. This can lead to complaints being categorized as a disciplinary issue and referred to the state building regulator. The state regulator might direct the complaint back to local government to use its powers to order work, a power which the state may not have. Alternatively, the state may characterize the same matter as a consumer affairs matter and refer it to dispute resolution body. Oh, wow. Can you just stepping away from the report and giving a comment? Actually, I'll zoom in a little bit there. Yep. Can you imagine how frustrating this could be for a consumer? The back and forth, the buck passing. Oh, let me know, guys, in the comments, please, if you have had a personal experience with this back and forth, because I've had friends that have been frustrated with some of their construction work. A mate who, the HIA didn't pay out their insurance, all these issues. Let us know in the comments. I think it'd be interesting to hear from you. Okay, back to the report. In 6 jurisdictions, private building surveyors have power to initiate enforcement action. Private building surveyors are sometimes reluctant to use these powers because of their commercial relationship with the builder and/or designer, or because they do not receive support from local or state government when they refer unresolved matters to them for further action. Well, there you go. There you go, right there. That's just showing you the conflict of interest and the fact that the government doesn't have their back. For there to be effective regulatory oversight, all authorities and private building surveyors with enforcement powers need to collaborate closely on the performance of their functions, the timing and nature of referrals, and the sharing of information. Recommendation 5. That each state establishes formal mechanisms for a more collaborative and effective partnership between those with responsibility for regulatory oversight, including relevant state government bodies, local governments, and private building surveyors, if they have enforcement role. Implementing the recommendation. Our aim is not to prescribe how each jurisdiction should institute these partnerships. Implementation could be achieved through enhancements to existing panels or committees. Alternatively, a new body could be established which would be dedicated to the task of enhancing regulatory practices. Some jurisdictions may wish to establish a regulatory practice panel. Okay. It is emphasized that the body proposed by the recommendation is not intended to be another advisory committee. Rather, the intention is to have a body that will focus on improving regulatory practice with a view to its members working together to effectively monitor building practitioners and building work. It needs to be possible. It needs to possess the authority to improve regulatory oversight. With this in mind, the new or existing body should be made up of representatives from relevant state government bodies, local governments, and private surveyors, if they have enforcement role. It might usefully be chaired by an independent person. The body could be formalized by administrative means or be a statutory body. Either way, it should report to the relevant ministers in its jurisdiction. The body should meet regularly to discuss collaborative regulatory practices and procedures. I can't even imagine a body or a group to be, that would be so boring. To support implementation of the recommendations, each jurisdiction will, as a first priority, wish to ensure that its legislation provides clear statements of responsibility for each authority. This will be essential to providing the necessary mandate for participation and to ensure clarity in the roles, responsibilities, and powers of each of the authorities. Any reforms needed should be developed having regard to how the various authorities will work together, providing effective oversight of the building and construction regulatory schemes. The body should have terms of reference which include the establishment and maintenance of written information sharing agreements that detail with matters such as shared risk and assessment practices, procedures for referrals, and content and procedures for information sharing, monitoring and advising the relevant ministers on the effectiveness of the regulatory oversight of the industry, and providing advice to the ministers as required, agreeing on the content of publications or joint websites which give clarity to both industry and public on complaint management processes and regulatory practices, and mechanisms for engagement with consumers and or industry associations. It may also be appropriate for fire authorities and building dispute resolution bodies to be part of this body. Boy, that sounds like an exciting new organization. Who would want to be on that? So, further observations. The territories work closely with private building surveyors, and as there is only one level of government involved, formal structures are unlikely to be necessary. It is a matter for the NT and the ACT to decide whether to implement this recommendation. Okay, recommendation number 6. Effective regulatory powers. The problem identified. Audits of cladding on high-rise buildings have raised wider questions about whether authorities have the necessary powers to require rectification, recall products, or issue warnings about products. This is interesting. particularly since we had another high-rise fire about cladding recently. Recommendation 6, that each jurisdiction give regulators a broad suite of powers to monitor buildings and building works so that, as necessary, they can take strong compliance and enforcement action. That sounds like a good idea. Implementing the recommendation. Whilst it is not necessary to have nationally consistent powers, it is envisaged that all jurisdictions will need to have a minimum range of legislative powers. Pardon me. I need a coffee. A lot of reading. So a minimum range of legislative powers, including powers of entry for monitoring compliance, powers of entry where there is reasonable relief of the commission of an offence or grounds for disciplinary inquiry, powers to require the production of documents or information, powers to investigate following a complaint or proactively, powers to seize documents and test and seize materials, powers to evacuate, make all necessary orders or stop work. Wow. Powers to negotiate voluntary undertakings, powers to undertake disciplinary processes, powers to performance to audit powers over all registered practitioners, including architects. Okay, they want to take that away from the boards. Interesting. Infringement notice and prosecution powers. The question of which authorities, state, territory, or local government or private building surveys should have which power is a matter for each individual jurisdiction. However, where the same or similar powers are to be given to more than one regulator, it may be helpful to have a clearly identified lead regulator. Okay, that sounds interesting. Could you imagine that happening on a job? What do you reckon, guys? Do you think this will give them more teeth? Do you think people will start, if you're saying, if you don't comply with this, you're taking this risk with this, authority coming in? Do you think that would have more of an impact? Regulation of the building product supply chain is warranted, and a product recall and a prohibition power should exist for high-risk building products. However, it has not been recommended that all building regulators be given such powers. It is a matter for government to decide whether such powers should sit with building or consumer affairs regulators. On one matter we are clear. If building regulators are to be given powers to regulate the supply chain, this work should not detract from their primary role. Yeah, that's a big issue. And a lot of people are commenting on other videos going, oh, we're just blaming China again, and we're just blaming China again. It's because of the dodgy product that's come in from China, the dodgy Australians have imported. So that's interesting, what can happen there. Wow, power to seize documents. All practitioners, including architects, to audit the... Wow. I wonder if that's going to be implemented. Let me know what you think about this, guys. Any architects watching? What do you reckon? Recommendation 7. Strategy for proactive regulation of commercial buildings. So, the problem identified. The construction of commercial buildings is generally commissioned by developers that are in the business of building buildings, even though they are not builders themselves and are not required to be registered. The end user of these buildings will not usually participate in the building process at all. The ability of a purchaser to assess the building's compliance with the NCC is limited. Consumers generally assume that the building regulatory system has delivered a building that is compliant with the NCC. This is not always the case, yes. As that is recognized, public confidence is undermined. Building approval processes across Australia generally provide for a very high level of self-certification of the design and construction of commercial buildings. Until now, there's been very limited proactive auditing by regulatory authorities of building work or of the registered practitioners involved in the construction of commercial buildings. Proactive auditing is imperative to restore public trust. Governments need to be able to detect and regulate inadequate practices A strategy for the proactive auditing of the construction of commercial buildings is required in every jurisdiction. Recommendation 7. That each jurisdiction makes its public audit strategy for regulatory oversight of the construction of commercial buildings with annual reporting on audit findings and outcomes. Okay, wow. Implementation and implementing the recommendation. It is essential that each jurisdiction have a public strategy for proactively auditing the design, certification, and construction of commercial buildings with a view to improving regulatory oversight, education, and enforcement. State regulators may collaborate with relevant councils for this work, but the responsibility for the strategy should rest with the relevant state or territory regulator in each jurisdiction. The strategy should include targeted audits of the documentation of commercial building projects, including the standard of documentation and quality of decision-making in relation to performance solutions, the conduct of building surveys to ensure adherence to regulatory requirements intended to mitigate against conflict of interest, and the work of builders, including the management of approvals for design development, variations, and product substitution. Product substitution, the bane of every bloody architect. Statutory powers to support such a statutory powers to support such a strategy should include performance audit powers applied to registered practitioners, powers to take immediate disciplinary action in high-risk cases, the ability to issue rectification orders or order the appropriate building surveyor to take reasonable actions, infringement and disciplinary powers, including requiring additional training, undertakings, fines, suspension or cancellation of registration, and the ability to disqualify directors in order to prohibit them from being involved in other building companies. I hope that can happen with developers as well. Maybe developers need to start being licensed. So, a public register of any enforcement action taken against any registered practitioner by the state or territory regulator should be established and maintained. Transparency is essential. Public feedback should be encouraged. To these ends, each jurisdiction should report annually on its strategy and on the outcomes and learnings from its audits. This will enhance public accountability, spread good practitioners across jurisdictions, and encourage collaboration with industry bodies. Further observations. Whilst the recommendations refers to auditing and oversight of the construction of commercial buildings, this should not be taken to mean that auditing and oversight of the construction of domestic buildings is not necessary. The recommendations is to prioritize the development of auditing programs for commercial buildings. Auditing might be extended to domestic buildings in the future. Okay, it's another big one. And recommendation 8. So I'm hitting 43 minutes. I think we will stop there for now with the recommendations, and I will do the next section in another video. So guys, thank you all very much for joining me for this episode. This isn't my regular content. I want to go through these reports and just do them like as a special series, and you'll see that's why I've color-coded the icons a bit different. So you can listen to this while you're doing, your dishes. So guys, please like, share, and subscribe. Ding the bell to see my updates, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye for now.